world has witnessed a flood of Eritrean refugees risking their lives on too often unseaworthy boats bound for Europe. The prevalence of Eritreans among refugees has been overshadowed by refugees from the Middle East, especially Syria. The UK, one of the prime destinations for Eritrean refugees, apparently wanted to slow down the flow of Eritreans into the country. Earlier this year, the UK reduced the percentage of asylum claims from 95% to 28%. Directly addressing the root causes of the flight of people who are voting with their feet, often at grave risks, seems a better policy than trying to determine the final destination of Eritreans who feel forced to leave their homes. That means an enhanced level of communication between the Eritrea's government and the international community. There has been quiet contacts between the government and the U.S. government and civil society. Today's hearing will examine how such contacts have developed. We hope the testimony in this hearing will answer some critical questions. Can the United States form a relationship with the government it has under sanction? Does the dire situation in which Eritrea's people live require an alteration of U.S. policy? What would a change in policy mean for the international effort to hold Eritrea's government responsible for blatant human rights violations? Again, I want to thank our distinguished witnesses in advance for being here, including and especially our distinguished Assistant Secretary, Linda Thomas Greenfield, who we'll get to shortly, but I'd like to yield to my friend, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and let me thank you for calling this hearing today. I think it is particularly important. You mentioned the refugee crisis, and we all know that the attention has been focused on refugees from Syria, but we know the number of people that are also fleeing Eritrea and not getting the same level of attention. I can't tell you how many times I have talked to folks from Ethiopia and Eritrea locally who will always stop and say, why don't you do hearings? Why don't you do hearings on what is happening in Eritrea? So I think that this hearing is particularly timely, and I appreciate you calling this today. I will say that in preparing for the hearing, a number of organizations, the Organization of Eritrean Americans and several other organizations are concerned and upset about why we are holding this hearing, taking the opposite point of view and saying that what we claim is happening in Eritrea is not. And I don't know if on the second panel, not with the Assistant Secretary, but maybe someone could explain why there are so many people fleeing the country if what is being talked about around the world is in fact not the case. Eritrea is known as a country that it is claimed is the most censored country in the world, has been cited repeatedly for its abysmal human rights record, and as you mentioned in terms of the issue of trafficking, I think that all is widely known, and so the question is, if this is so off, why does the world view Eritrea in this way? I'd like to ask the Assistant Secretary if she could share the administration's perspective regarding Eritrea's support of terrorism and the ongoing relevancy of the UN arms embargo and sanctions, whether the embargo and sanctions continue to be warranted, and on what basis should there be consideration to eliminating the sanctions. I'm also interested in your assessment of the role of the EU and its development programs with Eritrea. I know part of this, especially the increase in aid, is to stem the immigration, but I would like to know what your thoughts are on that. And I'm very interested in hearing witnesses representing the diaspora in the U.S. and what measures do these various diaspora groups support. Are they in support of a stronger relationship between Washington and Asmara, or a continuation of the current approach? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Very, very much. Before introducing our distinguished witness, without objection, and Ms. Bass and I talked about this a moment ago, I'd like to invite to the witness table as well our Director of Office of East African Affairs, Eric Whitaker, without objection, ask that he be added to the panel. And that was Ms. Bass's idea, and I thank her for it. I'd like to now introduce Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, a member of the Career Foreign Service, was sworn in on August 6, 2013 as the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. Prior to assuming her current position, she led a team of about 400 employees who carried out personnel functions for the State Department's 70,000-strong workforce. Since beginning her Foreign Service career in 1982, she has risen through the ranks as the Minister Consular level, serving in Jamaica, Nigeria, the Gambia, Kenya, Pakistan, and the U.S. mission to the UN, and most recently as Ambassador to Liberia, where she served from 2008 to 2012. And without objection, your full resume will be made a part of the record, and I'd like to now yield the floor to the distinguished Assistant Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Bass, for inviting me today and providing the opportunity for us to testify on the situation in Eritrea. And I'm pleased to have my colleague, Eric Whitaker, seated next to me. Eric is the Office Director for East African Affairs, and he was just in Eritrea for about 2 months working as our chargé. So he may be able to give a little more depth to questions that you might have about the current situation in Eritrea. After 25 years of independence, Eritrea today stands as a country best known for its immigration, and I say that word specifically so there's no misunderstanding. It's known for its immigration and its poor record on human rights. Out of a population of approximately 3.5 million people per UN estimates, an estimated 5,000 people a month flee the country. Many risk a perilous journey across Africa and across the Mediterranean at the hands of sometimes ruthless smugglers and in unsafe vessels. The country is hemorrhaging its youth. In a country that has never known an election, Eritreans, as you said, Mr. Chairman, are voting with their feet. They are fleeing indefinite conscription into military or national service, religious persecution, and other human rights violations and economic hardships. These same conditions frame the United States' relationship with Eritrea. In virtually every other country in Africa, including those with whom we have profound disagreements, we still seek to achieve partnerships across a range of shared global interests. We provide billions in foreign assistance to support those partnerships formed to fight HIV, AIDS, and malaria, to support education, to combat violent extremism, and to strengthen governance. In Eritrea, that's not the case, and that's because of the decisions of the Eritrean government. In 2005, the Eritrean government ordered USAID, other donors, international NGOs to leave the country. Subsequently, it ordered our Embassy Defense Attaché's office to close, and as a result, today, we have no bilateral assistance, no military-to-military relationships, and since 2010, we have not had an ambassador in Asmara. This is not the relationship we desire. Eritrea is one of the poorest countries on earth. It is located in a volatile and strategic neighborhood on the Red Sea. But if Eritrea likes to portray itself as David and the United States as Goliath, I would argue that its wounds are largely self-inflicted and its slingshots hurl stones at its own people. Up to 5,000 of them make this clear every single month, risking their lives rather than remaining in the country they love. Eritrea's continuing torrent of immigration is no doubt driven in part by economic conditions, but it is the human rights records that push so many people to leave. Over the past decade, the Eritrean government has arbitrarily detained journalists, political opposition members, and others trying to express their reform-minded to others who have tried to push for reforms. In 2001, the government detained without charge a group of reform-minded ministers and other prominent individuals who call for elections and implementation of the Constitution, and many of these individuals remain in prison till today. Almost all citizens, with few exceptions, are forced into indefinite conscription, into national service, and in many cases they are separated from their families for years. The government has imposed severe restrictions on the exercise of freedom of religion and belief and has subjected members of non-authorized religions to arbitrary detention and forced recanting as a condition of release. The government has singled out groups such as the Jehovah's Witnesses for particularly harsh treatment because of their members' refusal to bear arms in the independence struggle or to participate in national service. Eritrean officials have long justified their poor human rights record and their large-scale militarization on an emergency, quote, no war, no peace, unquote, situation over the unresolved demarcation of their border with Ethiopia. Eritrea has remained under a UN-imposed arms embargo and sanctions since 2009 for its actions that contributed to regional instability, including their support for al-Shabaab in Somalia. In the last two annual reports, the UN Somalia-Eritrea Monitoring Group has not found evidence of ongoing support to al-Shabaab, but Asmara has refused to allow the group to conduct investigations in Eritrea per its mandate, and this has limited the UN's ability to determine Eritrea's compliance with the sanctions regime. Eritrea also continues to hold Djiboutian prisoners of war and is accused of fomenting unrest in neighboring countries. For all these reasons, we have made it clear that turning a new page in the United States-Eritrea relationship first requires significant improvements in human rights. And we have repeatedly called on the government to abide by its international human rights obligations, implement its own constitution, hold national elections, honor its commitment to limit the duration of national service to 18 months, develop an independent and transparent judiciary, and release persons who have been arbitrarily detained. We also continue to support the work of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Somalia-Eritrea Monitoring Group, as well as other international efforts to make progress. And surprisingly, there has been some progress, albeit limited. In recent years, Eritrea has made some efforts to engage with the international community. The government reversed an earlier decision to close UN operations and has allowed some non-governmental organizations to return. Earlier this year, they released 4 of a larger group of Djiboutian prisoners of war who were reunited with their families for the first time since 2008. Eritrea has recently been more open to working with the European Union on development programs and has allowed a handful of international journalists to return to the country. Eritrea's efforts to engage with the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights are also welcome. The country accepted nearly half of the Universal Periodic Review recommendations, and we continue to encourage the government to follow through on these. But as I've noted, our bilateral relationship with Eritrea is not an easy one. But we have not, and we do not, seek to cut off diplomatic engagement nor communications. This summer, one of our Deputy Assistant Secretaries traveled to Asmara to visit our embassy there. Our charge and her team meet regularly with officials, and they host a variety of events at the American Center in Asmara for the Eritrean people. Many challenges remain, yet I have to say I'm impressed by the resiliency of the Eritrean people. Eritrea and Eritreans pride themselves in self-reliance in the face of adversity. The largest obstacle to peace and prosperity, however, is in their country, have been erected by their own government. We are encouraged by the small steps toward progress I've outlined above, and we would urge the government to take much larger strides forward by ending indefinite national service and releasing political prisoners. If given the opportunity to be heard and to fully and freely participate in their government, I truly believe that the people of Eritrea can do great things for their country. We look forward to the day when that is possible. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to your questions. And if I can't answer, I will turn to my colleague.
Director Whitaker, if you'd like to, I know you're on the spot a little bit, but if you'd like to make some oral comments, more than welcome.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. Then we'll move to some questions. First, beginning, if I could, with the Secretary. In your testimony, you talk about the Eritrea's efforts to engage the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights are welcome, that the country has accepted nearly half of the Universal Periodic Review recommendations. Could you elaborate on what half what is it that they have agreed to, and what remains unfocused upon and unaccomplished?
it's a pretty long list. Eric, do you have the details of what they've agreed to? And if not, I will get back to you with that.
We can follow up with that in writing to be more specific, sir, but several areas in development, most notably in the sectors of health and education, greater transparency, allowing larger number of visitors to obtain visas and to come and talk with government officials.
Okay. If you could get back with a very detailed description of that, that would be very, very helpful. I met with the High Commissioner for Human Rights in New York for lunch several weeks ago. We talked about South Sudan, we talked about Eritrea, and other hotspots that he is working on and expressing concerns about, Ethiopia as well. And, you know, I'd love to know, you know, Prince Zaid is doing his level best with dealing with cauldrons all over the world. But if the council did, you know, agree that some progress was being made, it would be helpful for this committee to have that. So thank you. Let me ask you with regards to former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Eritrea, Ronald McMullen, said that there were more than 4 dozen employees of the U.S. Embassy in Eritrea who were detained during his tenure. Also, the daughter of Eritrea, former Minister of Information, Siam al-Abdu, who is also an American citizen, is in prison. What can and are we doing to try to help her, to help others that we, you know, either worked for us or are, in her case, an American? And how many Americans are in Eritrean prisons?
As far as I know, she is the only American who is currently in prison. We have had, over the years, our FSNs harassed, our Foreign Service national employees harassed, some arrested, and some who are still currently being held by the government. We never miss an opportunity to raise this with the government of Eritrea, encouraging them to release the American citizen, but also to release our employees who have been arrested, and to discontinue the harassment of our employees.
Is there, like with the Chargé, when we are in country, does the embassy make active representations on their behalf? Do we get to visit? Are we just unaware of their fate?
I'll let our Chargé, former Chargé, answer that question.
Thank you.
Yes, sir, I did make representations last month with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in person, verbally and in writing to see Siam. We've asked for consular access repeatedly and not been granted it. We are concerned regarding the case. The answers we get are typically vague or note that such individual is an Eritrean citizen.
Do we know where she is? I mean, do we have any kind of information about her health, the treatment or lack of good treatment for her?
We've not received specific responses to our questions, sir.
Okay. Does her family know? I mean, do they feed into our information based on her?
I'm not certain when their last communication with her was, sir.
Okay. Let me ask you with regards to Father Haptu Gebre Ab has said that the government confiscates Bibles, punish people for open prayer, and of course, Eritrea is a country of particular concern. And I'm wondering what kind of impact the International Religious Freedom Office has had. Rabbi Saperstein, I know, is doing a wonderful job. Again, he has a full portfolio of egregious violators of religious freedom worldwide. But you know, this is a very serious issue. And Father also makes a point in his testimony that national service is a form of human bondage. And the tip report certainly goes into depth on that. And then Dr. Khalid Bashir, who will be testifying, points out that there may be as many as 20,000 11th graders who have been forced to work for the ruling party, supplying workers for Nevsum. He describes it as slave labor. Do we have any information on that? It would appear, you know, like the parallel child soldiering issue, forced labor of very young children and teenagers. And again, it's in the narrative again this year of our tip report. But what can we do to help on this? Has UNICEF engaged? Because they are leaders when it comes to the exploitation of children.
Well, certainly, you noted, and we noted as well, that on the religious freedom scale, Eritrea is a country of particular concern, and that the freedom to practice religion is strongly restricted by the government, even for those 3 or 4 religions that they recognize. And this is an important issue for us, and we've reflected that in our religious freedom report, and it's an issue that we do as well continue to raise with the government. On the issue of national service, one of the things that the Eritrean government agreed to was that they would limit, in the future, they would limit national service to 18 months. They have not honored that commitment, and for now, national service is almost for life. And what that means is that these young people are not able to take care of their families. They're not able to even plan for their futures. They are basically in a form of bondage for the rest of their lives. At the age of 11th grade, they go into training, and they are divided up and sent to various locations where they are required to perform their national service. Again, Eric was on the ground and may be able to provide a little more detail on that.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, Mr. Chairman. With respect to the national service after completion of 11th grade, as she has said, students proceed to the Sawa training camp. They basically are divided into 3 groups thereafter. A small portion continue to higher education. A certain number go into military service on behalf of the security services of the country. And the largest group goes into community service, wherein they may be assigned to the various ministries or other parastatals or other branches of the government. But this is where the youth of the country goes, and the service is indeterminate in length. And this is one of the reasons that the youth are departing the country.
Just a few final questions, and I'll yield to Ranking Member Bass. Can you describe why the government is showing some interest in reaching out to the international community, particularly some of these NGOs and providers of humanitarian aid in the EU? What's behind this motivation? What steps would need to be taken for the United States to upgrade its diplomatic standing? Is there any movement in that? Do you sense a positive or movement in that regard? The Ethiopian and Eritrean forces clashed along the border of the Sorona area. In his testimony, Dr. Bashir points out that resolution of the Eritrea-Ethiopia border dispute would take Eritrea out of its war footing, which is its justification for universal national service. What is your sense of that? I mean, what is being done to try to make that work? And finally, when a Eritrean man or woman goes to sea or goes to flight into Sudan, for example, or to Europe or wherever, if they are brought back, what is the penalty that they suffer as a result of the attempted flight for refugee status?
Good. The first question was, why do we think the Ethiopian, the Eritrean government continues or is opening up for opportunities to engage with the international community? And I think the answer to that is really simple, and that is the sanctions have increased the costs of Eritrea's policies. So they need the development assistance that the European Union and NGOs might be able to provide for them, particularly in the health and education sector, where they are allowing the few NGOs that they've allowed to come back in, the kind of work that they're allowing them to do. So I think their motive is a simple one. Their motive is simply need. And we've not seen, as this effort continues, we've not really seen any positive changes on the part of the government in terms of those areas that are important for us to change the nature of our engagement with the government. Those issues really require that the government take some serious measures to deal with the human rights situation in the country, to deal with the issues of press freedom, to deal with the issues of freedom of religion, to change their policy on national service, to limit it to 18 months so that these young people are able to engage in livelihoods that will allow them to have a future in the country. On the Ethiopia-Eritrea border dispute, we have encouraged both sides to work on a path to address this dispute. The report from the UN was, I think, very clear, and we hope that both sides look for ways other than through conflict, through war, to address this. And I don't know exactly what the penalty is if someone is returned. I suspect it's not a good thing for them, and I would suspect that they would be either arrested or forced to continue their national service.
If you could get back to us on that, yes.
Eric,
Whitaker.
you know?
Mr. Chairman, I was going to follow on the development side. The first question foremost. During my recent stay in Asmara as charge at our embassy, I spent quite a bit of time talking to UN agency heads and their other representatives and my counterparts with the other embassies. The door is slowly opening for development cooperation, but I pick my words carefully. It's development cooperation for the long term in close coordination with ministries, as opposed to short-term humanitarian assistance. The government is very adamant about this. The sectors which are allowed the most entry by outside partners, development partners, are in the health and education sectors. So the door is slowly opening. Limited number of NGOs, JICA from Japan, the UN agencies, and the EU Development Fund, as you mentioned earlier. These are all carefully negotiated agreements that this door is slowly opening. The number that flees each month doesn't seem to be slowing down, or it's 5,000 a month. The UNHCR told us that very directly by the registration of those departing the country, arriving elsewhere. But I'm not aware of circumstances of those who were forcibly returned. That's not come to my attention. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I deal Ms. Bass.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony, and I especially want to thank Mr. Whitaker, knowing we put you on the spot there, but I really appreciate your input. Eritrea remains such a mystery, and I wanted to know if you could describe a little bit about what life is like there. And also, what is the ideology of the regime? What is driving it? You know, you described the national service, you described it in 3 different categories: higher ed, the military, and government service. What determines which way one goes? That's to begin.
Well, thank you for the question, Madam Ranking Member. The problem is when one is in Asmara, one sees only a limited spectrum of society of Eritrea. Our ability to to travel, rather, in country is somewhat limited. Most Eritreans are engaged in small-scale agriculture, herding, millet, sorghum, and other crops. Their life is relatively simple. In urban areas, it's more limited. Many of the people we're encountering are working with parastatals.
What?
Or working with parastatals, state-owned enterprises, ma'am, and small-scale businesses, or perhaps working with the NGOs or embassies. Many of folks, of course, are in community service, including many of the employees at the government ministries. We see in the economy that the mining sector and the remittances sent by those abroad are very important to keeping the economy going. I think the fact that 5,000 people are leaving a month is a reflection in part, not just on human rights, but also diminished life chances, and that is that many don't see many economic opportunities, so they decide that perhaps it's better to take their chances to depart the country and send back remittances to support their relatives.
You know, you described the inability to travel very much, and so why is that? Does the government, you know, we had that relationship like with Cuba, for example. You know, U.S. diplomats and Cuban diplomats couldn't travel beyond a 25-mile radius. What is limiting your movement in Asmara?
The current limitation is on all internationals in Asmara. They must apply with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in advance, in writing, to depart from a 25-mile radius of Asmara.
Okay, so I'm still trying
And
to...
we have that same, excuse me, we have that same policy for Eritrean diplomats here in the United States as well.
I see. So I'm
reciprocal.
still trying to understand the society. So that's why I asked, what is the ideology that is driving this? Is this a socialist regime? I mean, it reminds me of Cambodia. You were talking about people, well, in Cambodia, people were forced from the city to the rural area. So what is the underlying ideology of the government that leads the country to be organized this way?
No, I would argue that it's an ideology that's based on a strong sense of sovereignty and independence and self-reliance that came out of the many years of fighting and their independence movement. And there are still a lot of people who strongly believe in that ideology and are willing to deal with the extensive adversity that people are under there to continue to survive. But I do think that it's time for change. And I think most Eritreans believe that it's time for change, and they deserve a peaceful transition.
Do they see themselves as a socialist country? I mean, you know, I know that there's very limited private sector, so is that how they see themselves?
I have not heard that terminology used. I've heard self-reliance more used as a philosophy.
So what determines then in the three categories, higher ed, government service, and military, or community service? I mean, community service doesn't sound bad, so tell me why it is.
I think they use this to ensure that they have the people to do the various activities that they require of their people. So I was told recently that you see large numbers of people who are in government service who are directing traffic outside, for example.
Do they not get paid?
I think it's a very limited amount.
Yes, ma'am, it is a low pay. We've heard as low as $10 a month.
Do they have parts of their life subsidized? Is housing subsidized? Do they have a healthcare system? I mean, how do they function?
I'd be interested in hearing our Eritrean colleagues who are coming next, but I know that a huge part of how they function is through their family members who are living elsewhere, the diaspora community supporting families.
So once again, what determines higher ed, government service, or military?
Well, I think we're going to have to get back. Those are the three categories they use, and I'm not sure how they decide
Who goes where?
who goes where.
Okay.
I think most people want to go to higher ed because it's not a.
But then, okay, so you go to higher ed, and what can you do with it?
You teach, you work in schools, you do whatever the government wants you to do in the education sector.
And, and so I'm assuming that these three categories are both men and women, so are women in the military?
Women are in the military, and Eritrean women were known for their activities and their abilities during the fight for independence.
So what is the rationale of the EU then in terms of the developmental assistance? Because you too said, I believe, we provide no developmental assistance, but the EU does.
It's simple, and it just started. It's because they are the largest beneficiary of these 5,000 people a month who
Oh, they
are
want them to
fleeing
stay there.
the country. So they're looking
Right.
for development opportunities so people don't leave.
Do you know how they do development assistance? Meaning, are there European NGOs that actually get the money versus the Eritrean people?
Do you know the answer to that?
No, we fund NGOs, a lot of times, right? Our own NGOs.
Yes, ma'am. The EU Development Fund does provide funding through specific ministries, especially in health and education. JICA is there, the Japanese International Cooperation Agency. The NGOs include Finnish Church Aid, the Norwegian Refugee Council, VITA from Ireland, and they provide services predominantly in health and education sectors as well.
Do you think we should start providing assistance?
I don't think we've reached the point where we can provide assistance to this government. We are looking for certain changes to occur in how the government functions, how the government operates, and how it treats its people. So at the moment, there are no plans for us to provide further assistance.
Are people still trying to flee to Israel?
Ma'am, I don't believe so. The pattern that I had noted, and this is in discussion with UNHCR and quite a number of others, including ICRC, is that most refugees depart for Ethiopia or Sudan, finding their way up through Egypt and Libya, going across the Mediterranean, often to join relatives that are in Italy, the UK, Switzerland, or elsewhere within Europe.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Just let me ask one final question, if I could. In her testimony, Ms. Bruton, Deputy Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council, points out that what so far is missing from the record is Eritrean government's point of view. She testifies that the absence of this perspective is terribly dangerous to U.S. interests in the Horn of Africa and beyond, and it's painfully then easy to get it wrong. Obviously, with Mr. Whitaker here, who has been in country and was our representative there as DCM, and Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, your work with an entire backing of a State Department that works very hard to get it right. Have we misperceived Eritrea somehow? It seems to me that when it comes to fundamental human rights, and as you both of us said, people voting with their feet because of a serious wave of repression and poverty, a self-isolation of shooting oneself in the foot. When people raise the issue of nearby Ethiopia, adjacent Ethiopia, both Greg and I were in Ethiopia in 2005, met with President Meles, and on the plane began sketching out the Ethiopia Human Rights Act because so many dissenters were shot in the streets. And yesterday, we introduced HRES 861 and are planning a series of hearings on Ethiopia to very strongly protest the gross violations of human rights, the murders that are taking place. At our press conference yesterday, we had the silver medalists for the marathon who spoke very effectively about this attack on Ethiopia. And so this subcommittee takes a backseat to no one in trying to be as clear-headed and focused on human rights abuses wherever, and of course the country reports on human rights practices is a textbook on these abuses, and I thank you for that again. The CPC designation couldn't be more clear, and the Tier 3 designation for the trafficking victims tip report couldn't be more clear as well. So are we somehow getting it wrong, as Ms. Bruton suggests?
Sir, I think the facts on the ground in Eritrea speak for themselves. We are dealing with a situation where we do have strong evidence of violation of human rights in Eritrea. But that said, it is important that we engage this government, and we do engage the government. We have diplomatic relations with the government of Eritrea. And so we do engage with this government, both through our embassy in Asmara, as well as through our contacts with the charge here and when they've had government officials come to the country. And I encourage the Eritrean government to engage. If they have a story to tell, if they want us to understand the situation better, the Somalia Eritrea monitoring group should be allowed to come in and should be allowed to engage so that they can tell their side of the story, so that if we're not getting it right, we can see the evidence of that. But right now, the evidence that we have point to the fact that serious human rights conditions exist in this country, and that we need to continue to address those until we see that they no longer exist.
And Mr. Whitaker, Director Whitaker, thank you so much for your testimony. If you could get back with some of those answers to elaborate, and we might have some additional questions that will be posed to you. Deeply appreciate it. I'd like to now welcome our second panel, beginning with Father Habtu Gebrab, who is the Canonical Eritrean Orthodox Church in Diaspora. He serves as a parish priest in Holy Trinity Eritrean Orthodox Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, and is also the Director of External Relations for the Canonical Eritrean Orthodox Church in Diaspora under the imprisoned Patriarch and His Holiness's designated bishop. The Diaspora Diocese includes all of North America, Europe, and the Middle East. He is a senior faculty with a rank of full professor at the University of Cincinnati, where he has taught for over a quarter of a century. The focus of his study is African history, specializing in colonial history in the Horn of Africa. For several years now, he has published several articles on and advocated for religious freedom, separation of church and state, and on behalf of all political prisoners in Eritrea. Secondly, we'll hear from Dr. Khalid Bashir, who is a board member of the Awate Foundation, World Media Service on Eritrea, which promotes peace and reconciliation within Eritrea. He is an independent risk management consultant and subject matter expert in the Horn of Africa, specializing in development finance. He advises various UN agencies, international organizations, investors, and law firms on assessment of geopolitical, regulatory, and financial risks. As an Eritrean American and longtime advocate of human rights in Eritrea for the last 25 years, he works closely with Eritrean civil societies, political organizations, media outlets, and community leaders. In 2000, he was a member of a group of Eritrean intellectuals and professionals who met with the Eritrean president and urged him to introduce political and economic reform and the respect for the rule of law. And third, we will hear from Ms. Bruton, who is Deputy Director of the Council's, Atlantic Council's Africa Center. She is recognized authority on the Horn of Africa. She is especially well known for authoring a series of prominent reports and journal essays on Somalia. She provides regular expert commentary on African political affairs for major international media and held an international affairs fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior to her fellowship appointment, Ms. Bruton managed the National Endowment for Democracy's multi-million-dollar portfolio of small grants to local and international non-governmental organizations operating in East and Southern Africa, and managed post-conflict political transition programs in Africa for the U.S. Agency for International Development. She has also served as a policy analyst on international affairs and trade team for the Government Accountability Office. So Father Habtu, if you could begin. Could you put on the, thank you.
The Honorable Chairman Smith and members of the subcommittee, I thank you for the privilege of being here today to give my testimony on the challenges Eritrea represents and why failure to positively contribute to the resolutions of these challenges will affect the entire region and beyond. My name is Father Athanasius Habtu Gebrab. I'm an Eritrean American, a professor of history at the University of Cincinnati, and an ordained priest in the Eritrean Orthodox Church. I am pained by the general instability in the Horn of Africa and the unresolved conflict and animus between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which in one way or another remains at the very root of the instability in the region. We also note the untold and continuing suffering of the people of Eritrea and the dashing of the early optimism and hopes the world initially saw for this new country. We have also witnessed the extreme reluctance of the United States, a country which the people of the region, rightly or wrongly, have historically looked to as a reliant mediating power. In the remaining time I have, please allow me to speak to you about one aspect of Eritrea's egregious human rights violations, namely its denial of religious freedom to its people, a subject of my expertise. The following are but a few facts. Long before all the independent press in Eritrea were ruthlessly shut down in September 2001, the publications of the Eritrean Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church were shut down. In 1994, the Jehovah's Witnesses became the first victims. Within a month, the government unleashed massive campaigns of arrest and disappearance against the Muslim community in Eritrea. Next, the government's systematic anti-religious campaign moved to the ranks of the military, especially in Sawa, the sprawling military training camp near the Sudanese border. Here, all Bibles were confiscated, and anyone caught praying was subjected to the cruelest treatments by the military establishment. This practice was soon expanded throughout the military across the country. In April 2002, the government passed a sweeping decree closing all minority Christian denominations and other sects. Soon after, their leaders and adherents were vigorously rounded up and imprisoned, and I personally witnessed that at the time. The government accelerated the total control of the largest and most ancient religious institution in Eritrea, the Eritrean Orthodox Church. In November 2004, the leading lights of the church were imprisoned. A little over a year later, the Patriarch of the Eritrean Orthodox Church, His Holiness Abuna Antonios, was illegally deposed from his patriarchal throne and imprisoned. This was followed by the subsequent imprisonment of hundreds of other clergies. Today, it is estimated that between 2,000 to 3,000 people are in prison for their faith. The question now is, what is to be done to bring about stability to Eritrea and the region? The Eritrean government should immediately implement the constitution that was ratified in 1997, but was never implemented. This will guarantee its people the rights enshrined therein, thus removing fear, uncertainty, and the guarantees of rights. The so-called national service has degenerated into an unsustainable, unjust, and immoral practice, which results in the youth fleeing the country in such a large number. It must come to an immediate end. The thousands of prisoners of conscience must be released. The United States should re-engage with the government of Ethiopia and Eritrea to end the so-called no war, no peace state of affairs of the past 16 years and mediate lasting peace in the region by helping in the implementation of the Ethiopian-Eritrean Boundary Commission ruling of April 13, 2002. Eritrea and Ethiopia must be encouraged to cease hosting armed opposition groups in their respective countries to destabilize one another. Again, I thank you.
Thank you so very much for your testimony and for your concrete recommendations to the committee and, by extension, to the White House and State Department. Thank you so much. I'd like to now ask Dr. Bashir if you would proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, for giving me this opportunity to testify in this important hearing to evaluate EO's policy towards Eritrea. My name is Khalid Bashir. I'm a longtime advocate of human rights in Eritrea. My testimony will be shaped by 25 years of closely following the activities of the government of Eritrea, those who are still in power, and those who were once powerful who have been exiled or made to disappear and are presumed jailed or dead. In this hearing, I'll try to, as outlined in my written statement, why the unconditional engagement of Eritrea, as recommended by some, is dangerous. And a short answer to that, it has been tried before. To start with, the reason the Eritrean regime is as bad as it is topping the list of every human rights organizations, is precisely because for 8 long years, the United States and Western European gave it unconditional support. This is between 1991 and 98. When the new government was given the benefit of the doubt, the Clinton administration provided military assistance, facilitated low-interest loan and grants, and contributed in capacity building, and praised the autocratic system routinely, calling it part of the Africa Renaissance. A short-lived description praising the heads of state of Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, Congo, and Eritrea. And what was the outcome? Ethiopia is what you see in the headlines today. The leaders of Uganda and Rwanda amended their constitution to extend their rule. Congo descended into civil war. And it is during that period of unconditional engagement that all these atrocities in Eritrea, the Eritrean regime is infamous for: arbitrary arrest, disappearance, banning religious organization, exiling, severe restriction on civil liberties were germinated. So for those who are arguing that there should be unconditional resumption of U.S.-Eritrean relation, all they need to look is back at the history of the early 90s, and this is why we are here. As far as the human rights conditions are concerned, it has been extensively covered by the UN Security Repertoire on Human Rights and the Human Rights Council of Commission of Inquiry. So rather than speaking about the human rights violation in Eritrea that has been extensively documented, I'd like to speak about very little known about the role of Nefson, the Canadian mining company, as has finally disclosed it, that has been funding the Atlantic Council campaign for the last 18 months to rehabilitate the image of Eritrea and whitewash the human rights abuses, and calling for the unconditional U.S. engagement in Eritrea. The reason is the interest of Nefson, the mining company, is intertwined with the interest of the regime. Nefson Resource is a Canadian mining company, and the Eritrean government, through Enamco, jointly own the Bisha mine. That's the only source, revenue-generating source for Nefson. Why would, you might ask, why would that be important for Nefson? Aside that it has been accused of militarized commerce and using slave labor in building the Bisha mine, is for the following reason. Simply, in the last 5 years, the stock valuation in Nefson has stagnated at about $3.50 for the last 6 years. This is unusually very low for a company that sits at $1.3 billion of assets. So Nefson tried many things to improve its image. It failed, it sought and failed to be acquired by a larger firm. It failed to diversify its single source of revenue from Bisha. It failed to impress investors and shareholders by glossy, unaudited corporate responsibility and environmental reports. It has failed to shake off its reputation as an enabler of human rights abusing regimes. It has failed the human rights organizations that it no longer uses slave labor. It failed to comply with United Nations Somali Eritrean Monitoring Group request to disclose financial transaction records. It has failed to bring any meaningful economic betterment to the lives of Eritreans other than enriching the coffers of the regime. So Nefson thought to rehabilitate Eritrean image instead. Knowing that its efforts were hampered by Eritrean dismal human record, Nefson quickly settled multiple lawsuits paying close to $30 million, hired a public relations firm, hired a purported human rights attorney, and courted the diplomatic community in Asmara. Still, all its efforts failed. While overt attempts failed to make a dent, Nefson turned to a more subtle approach of funding the Atlantic Council to rehabilitate its image and that of Eritrea so that it can lobby on its behalf. We often see the vice president of Nefson and one of the associates of Atlantic Council, Mrs. Bruton, appearing in the ruling party's events and rallies and speaking to drum up support for the regime. So, in short, to conclude my statement, I'd like to say that Eritrea is a mineral-rich country strategically located in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea, where the U.S. has vital strategic interest and legitimate concern in its ongoing counterterrorism campaign. Hence, the U.S. strategic interest should not depend on the fate of one ailing man, particularly when dealing with a regime that not only share any of the values of the U.S. enshrines, but routinely mocks it. While recognizing that the Eritrean people's challenge could only be resolved by Eritreans, it's prudent for the U.S. to be prepared to deal not with how to rehabilitate President Isaiah's image, but rather who has supported Eritreans, who has no support by Eritreans and rules by fear, but with the post-Eritrean Eritrea by taking the following steps aimed at shortening the suffering of the Eritrean people and safeguarding U.S. interests in the region. And they are as follows: to deny President Isaiah the excuse to maintain a war footing, pressure Ethiopia to allow the demarcation of the border, and to proceed at least in the 95% of the undisputed borders areas. Continue making human rights issue a precondition for U.S.-Eritrea relation. Continue supporting the current UN-sponsored sanction against Eritrea until the condition for lifting are met. Support the UN Security Council members' initiative to refer the UN Human Rights Commission of Inquiry to the International Criminal Court. Provide humanitarian assistance to Eritrean refugees, and to provide immigrant visas to help them come to the US and ask other countries to do so, especially of the unaccompanied minors that are fleeing Eritrea now in in the refugee camps in Ethiopia. Also provide temporary protective status for Eritrean refugees who are already in the US. To also support regional organization government effort in combating human trafficking in the Horn of Africa. But also, most importantly, I urge you to sanction mining companies like Nipson that is engaged in militarized commerce and using conscript labor force by designating their production as conflict minerals. People who suffer under authoritarian regimes look up to the world community, especially the United States, for support. They become disappointed and disillusioned when they discover misinformed consultants in a position to advise government. It is disheartening to see aggressive approach to absolve a totalitarian regime by individuals who have no personal stake in the outcome and only interested to promote their careers and personal interests. The liberal democratic force in Eritrea has a great potential to grow, but attempts to bury it in its infancy by using the theory, using there is no viable opposition claim is a crime against the Eritrean people. I urge this august body not to repeat the mistakes committed during the Clinton era when the Eritrean dictator was hailed as a Renaissance leader and provided with all the sorts of support, a lifeline that had helped it grow to the monster that has become. I urge this body to take the right decision inspired by American value. I urge you to remain a beacon of hope for the young democratic force, inspire them with the right decision, with a much wronged Eritrean citizens in mind. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Bashir. I'd like to now go to Ms. Bruton for her testimony.
Thank you. I am grateful to Congressman Smith, the chair, and Congresswoman Bass, the ranking member, for allowing me to contribute to the subcommittee's timely review of U.S. policy towards Eritrea. I have had the opportunity to travel to Eritrea several times in the last 18 months. I have met repeatedly with senior officials in the country, and I have had an opportunity to meet once with President Isaias for a long meeting in which we spoke very candidly about the state of affairs in Eritrea and about the state of U.S. relations with Eritrea. What I am presenting is a summary of my written testimony, and I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record.
Without objection, yours and all of our witnesses today, without objection.
Thank you. I imagine we'll talk about Nefson later on, so I would like to use my brief spoken remarks to raise a flag of caution. I, as you mentioned, am a Somalia expert, and I want to briefly turn our attention back to Somalia in 2006, when the United States accepted Ethiopia's allegations that the Union of Islamic Courts was an evil regime, an entity that was controlled by al-Qaeda. And as a result of that, we allowed, or perhaps more than allowed, Ethiopia to invade Somalia, and in doing so, they destroyed the only legitimate grassroots governance movement that has ever emerged in that country, at least since independence in the 1960s. Not only that, we cleared a space for al-Shabaab, and we created the conditions in which it prospered and is now a terrorist organization that is spreading carnage across East Africa. I raise this because I feel it's important for us to remember that though we do our best, we in the United States are capable of catastrophic mistakes when it comes to the Horn of Africa. And I want to particularly point out that all of the conditions that led us to make those mistakes in Somalia in 2006 pertain to our discussion of Eritrea today. When it comes to Eritrea, unfortunately, we are also guilty of a bias towards the Ethiopian point of view. I saw that bias evident in my respected colleague, the Assistant Secretary's remarks, when she was asked about the reason for the Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict, and she failed to note that Ethiopia is in violation of international law. There is a firm and final binding of an international border commission set up in The Hague that says very clearly that Ethiopia is illegally occupying Eritrean territory. We need to accept that. And our refusal to do so is, I think, a fairly clear sign of our bias towards the Ethiopian point of view. That led to an error in Somalia that cost us dearly. As in 2006, I wish to remind us that it had been about 10 years since we'd had eyes on the ground in Somalia, and our intelligence was very poor. In Eritrea today, it has also been about a decade since we have had eyes on the ground in that country, and our intelligence is very poor. When I planned to go to Eritrea 18 months ago, I met with a large number of government officials and members of our intelligence community. And when I asked a particularly brilliant member of our intelligence committee, who had studied Eritrea for 10 years, what I should be alert for when I went to the country, she told me this: find out if there's a government in Eritrea outside of Asmara. Now, we've heard from our human rights community, who rightly expresses concern about the terrible state of affairs in that country, that the government exercises pervasive control over every aspect of life. But we also have people in our intelligence community, and I would agree with their assessment, who wonder if the government really has any control at all outside of the capital city. That is a worrying state of affairs, and I think that it should cause us to exercise a real caution. I've heard a large number of statements today that were presented uncomplicatedly as fact, but which I am aware of are hot topics of dispute within the intelligence and analytic community. And if I had the time, I would go over them. But I've certainly highlighted most of them in my written testimony. Finally, I want to express that as in Somalia in 2006, I feel we have a bit of tunnel vision in Eritrea. It's an immensely complicated country with real security concerns and a real problem with its much more powerful neighbor. But the vast majority of our conversation is about human rights. It's okay and it's well and good that we should discuss human rights, but those concerns should be addressed proportionately. All the countries in the Horn of Africa have hideous human rights problems, including our closest ally, Ethiopia. And I think that when we single out Eritrea for concern, we raise the real possibility that our views will be either regarded as hypocritical or else, in other cases, muted because of our counterterror concerns, and that does damage to our standing in the Horn of Africa. In Eritrea, we can't afford to get it wrong, as we did in Somalia, because Eritrea is more strategically positioned on the Horn of Africa than Somalia is. It's right across from Yemen. It's on a critically important trade route that accepts trillions of dollars a year in the passage of goods between China and the EU. If we get it wrong there, the impact on U.S. relations will be terrible, and that will not serve our interests. Focusing on Eritrea as a threat to our interests instead of recognizing that, in fact, though we don't recognize it, it actually plays an important role as a wall through which bad actors in the Horn of Africa are not permitted to pass through to bad actors in the Gulf, is important. It's a commonality that we can use to work with Eritrea and constructively address the concerns that we have about human rights. I think I've heard consensus from a lot of people today that engaging the government in some way would be a good idea. I do not argue for non-conditional engagement with Eritrea, for the record, but I do believe that we could do a lot better. And for the record, I would like to state that I think a congressional delegation to Eritrea to examine the complexity of the issues that they're facing for yourselves would be a very, very good start. I thank you for permitting me to testify.
Ms. Bruton, thank you very much for your testimony as well. I'd like to first ask Father Gabriel, if you could. You mentioned 2,000 to 3,000 prisoners of conscience who are incarcerated because of their faith. And I wonder if you can tell us, is that both men and women, or children included? Are they tortured? Are there attempts to coerce them to reject their faith? And if so, to what end, perhaps? How long are the usual sentences for a believer? Is it 5 years, 10 years, life? And when released, where do they go? I mean, do they leave totally impoverished with families who, because I often argue, even in ordinary criminal justice systems, when one family member goes to prison, the whole family, in a way, goes to prison. It often leads to an impoverishment. But this would seem to be even more extreme. When they come out, where do they go? So if you could perhaps speak to that.
It is
Yes.
both men and women, young and old. The condition of their imprisonment is about as horrid as one can expect. Now, so many prisons, recognized and unrecognized, dot the landscape of Eritrea. Many times, no one knows where they are. They never appear in front of a court and charged with any kind of crime, and therefore, no one knows when they would be coming out. Now, particularly, for instance, I have made a list of people who have been in prison for the last 12 years now, and they have never seen the inside of the court. They have never been charged with anything, and these were, as I have explained in my longer remark, really the leading intellectuals within the Eritrean Orthodox Church. They remain in prison, and there has always been torture, and as previously stated also, an attempt at forcing them to recant their faith. Very often, statements have been made about minority Christian and other sects, but really the larger churches are not immune from this either, the so-called recognized churches. The Eritrean Orthodox Church, as I have clearly pointed out in my longer version of my presentation, has literally been taken over by the government, and it has become as if it is one department of the government. And the government's thinking, as I see it, is that by controlling the Eritrean Orthodox Church, which is almost 50% of its population, it thinks that it controls half the population of Eritrea as well. But I would also like to point out that really the lack of religious liberty in Eritrea is only one aspect of human rights violation. And if there is going to be any improvement in human rights violation, we cannot really cherry pick this right and that right. It has to be approached in its totality. And the only thing that will ensure that is the implementation of the constitution that was ratified by the people in Eritrea in 1997.
Let me ask you, if I could, Ms. Bruton, with regards to some of the points that were raised by Dr. Bashir. Just in the interest of full and total disclosure, do you or anybody that you are affiliated with derive any funding directly or indirectly from the government of Eritrea or from NEVSUM or any of its affiliates?
We do not derive any funding whatsoever from the government of Eritrea. NEVSUM, which is a publicly traded Canadian corporation, made a grant to the Atlantic Council in 2015.
How much was that?
It was between $100,000 and $249,000. I would like to give you the exact amount. My understanding is that it's not the policy of the Atlantic Council to do that. If they will permit me to, I will add it to the record very
And if you could encourage him, it does help us to know, if there is any financial entanglement.
Well, and regardless, the six-figure grant is a lot of money. There's no doubt about it. I want to make it clear that the grant was unconditional. It was general support for the Africa Center. I have no direct relationship with NEVSUM. I have not received a raise or a promotion or any other kind of incentive as a result of that grant. I do not control the funding. The funding is controlled by Dr. J. Peter Pham, our director, whose views on Eritrea are in the congressional record and diametrically opposed to my own. My own support for the Eritrean government goes back to 2009. In fact, I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs that the Eritrean government attached to its letter of protest to the UN Security Council when it was sanctioned. So my views have long been on the record and have not been altered in any way, shape, or form by NEVSUM or by anyone else.
To the best of your knowledge, has NEVSUM or any of its those that they're working with, including the Eritrean affiliate, supported the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, or the EITI? Do you? I mean, we've had hearings on that in my subcommittee for years. We know that DRC, Tanzania, Zambia, Mozambique are EITI members. 13 other African countries are EITI compliant. Ethiopia is an EITI candidate, but Eritrea is not. So I'm not even sure if they're trying, and maybe you could shed some light on that. But it seems to me, what are if you could answer that, and secondly, do you have a sense as to the condition of the workers? When we did Sudan sanctions in this committee, and I was chairman then, we tried very hard to delist a Canadian company that was very much complicit in the crimes that were being committed by Khartoum. And we failed. Wall Street rose up in arms and said, you can't do this. We said, look, if they're garnering huge amounts of money and they're part of a regime that is committing horrific crimes against South Sudan, which is what is now South Sudan, 2 million dead, 4 million displaced. Greg Simpson and I were just there 3 weeks ago, almost 4 weeks ago, in Juba. It's a mess. Not the subject of this hearing, but a mess. But we tried to do this delisting, and it was a Canadian company that was very much involved with, they were a Canadian oil company. And I'm just wondering, this extractive industry, condition of the workers, is there any monitoring being done? Are any of these kids, are any of these people child laborers? It was Talisman Energy, Greg just reminded me, it just slipped my mind. So it's, what about that? The workers?
I have to say, genuinely, I have never been to the Bisha mine, and so I'm not necessarily the best person to testify to the conditions. I can point you to a written description of Bisha by Louis Mazel, who's been the charge in Asmara. Right. He visited with a large number of other European diplomats, and he frankly wrote a glowing report of conditions at Bisha. That's the best that I can do since I haven't seen it at first hand. I would also note that the UN Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea, when it wrote its first report, which I read carefully, contained a number of allegations about the NEVSUM mine, which I understand they examined carefully and then dropped from the final version of the report because I believe that they were unable to substantiate them. Again, those are not first-hand testimonials, but it's relevant evidence, and I can at least point to you.
So you would support Eritrea joining EITI?
I would, and it's my understanding, again, from the diplomatic community and from conversations with Nevson, that they very, very much support it and are working actively to try to make that happen. They are also conducting a large number of human rights trainings at the Bisha mine that I'm aware of, that they're also very proud of. I mean, I feel constrained from talking too much about them because there is a financial relationship between Nevson and the Atlantic Council, at least in the past, and I don't want to be their spokesperson in any way, shape, or form. But I would point you towards what's on the record, at least.
Let me just ask you with regards to the human rights situation. I mean, the State Department's country reports of human rights practices is an indictment on a myriad of human rights abuses being committed. I mentioned the CPC designation based on religious persecution, and Father elaborated on just the number of people who are actually incarcerated for their faith, and the Tier 2 designation by the U.S. Department of State's TIP office, which painstakingly looks at child and sex trafficking, and they're the worst. They're among the worst in the world. Do you agree with that or disagree with that?
I do not disagree with that.
Okay. I'd like to yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, for any questions she might have.
Thank you. I would like to ask the panel some of the same questions I asked the last panel, really trying to understand the country. And so I began by asking, what is the ideology that guides the country? I also asked, in the three categories of higher ed, military, and government service, what determines that, to begin with? So is there an underpinning ideology that guides the way the country is organized?
Let me try to answer the first question. Is there a guiding ideology in Eritrea? Now, looking on the history of Eritrea's fight for independence, during the entire 70s and the 80s, and even going back to the 60s, the guiding ideology was Marxism. There's no question about it. And when Marxism fell out of favor, quietly they seemed to abandon it, but never officially actually abandoned it. And a lot of the policies of the government are still informed. Whenever they have a very difficult time, it seems to me like it's a fallback ideology, and therefore there's no doubt about it. I mean, they've always referred to themselves as a Marxist organization, and therefore I don't think anybody can argue that. Do we see that in its policies today? Yes. It's a fallback ideology, always. And I'll tell you something. I look at the publications the organizations put out, especially as it concerns religious freedom. In many publications, it actually lists the number of religious organizations that it was going to do away with, which it has. And therefore, this is not really some unknown ideology. It is very, very close tied to Marxism, but also it has degenerated, of course, into a one-man rule. There's no question about that.
So, and both of you were born in Eritrea?
I was born and raised. I was born and raised in Ethiopia of Eritrean parents, but my academic discipline.
What? Oh, I'm sorry.
My academic interest has always been Eritrea also, and until 2003, I traveled to Eritrea extensively. So,
oh, you're not able to go back and forth?
No, not since
2003.
No.
You see.
Yes, I was born in Eritrea, and I left at the age of 18, and I've been here in the United States since.
Are you able to go back and forth? Or
well, the last time we went was in 2002 with a group of colleagues. The group known as G13. I have one of my colleagues here, Dr. Asaf Fartahoste. That is the group that trying to appeal to President Isaias to implement the Constitution, to reform, to do some economic reforms. And of course, that was kind of brushed off, and we were not successful. This is in October 2000. It's been like 16 years. So this is the last time I have been here. As to the question about the ideology, there is no ideology. You know, to characterize a totalitarian regime, a tyrant, I wouldn't trying to beat my head trying to figure out what is the ideology of Gaddafi or Bokassa or Idi Amin or Saddam Hussein for that matter, as just simply tyrants trying to stay in power at any cost.
So can you guys answer for me, because I keep asking the same question, I haven't gotten an answer about it.
Go ahead.
About the 3 categories and how is it decided who goes where?
So after the 11th grade, all students go to the Sawa camp where they finish their high school.
Right.
Based on the grade they achieve, which most of them, there's a cutoff mark, ascertain they would go to the university, or there's no university, there's a technical college where they go to. But the majority of them, almost like 95%, go serve in the army, and some of them as a civil servant, as in the military.
So it's based on test scores? Some
Yes.
people who don't score well go to the military, or if you score well, you go to the military?
No, you don't score well, you go to the military. You have to have high grades to advance to the technical colleges. But the cutoff is so high, and they're very selective. 95% of them end up in the military for a simple reason, because Eritrea doesn't have the capacity to absorb all of them or even a large portion of them. There are very limited seats at the technical college, so most of them end up in the training in the army, or being sent as conscripts in the Bisha mine to work in the mines in Bisha.
Okay.
So to answer your question, there is also appointments to the government. The qualification is simply on loyalty, especially mid-cadre and upper government. You cannot possibly work for the Eritrean government if you fail the loyalty test. All the high government officials are very fiercely loyal to the government. How do we know that? From the defection of the ministers, the generals, the high-ranking military who defect, we talk to them. And this is the reason that the brain drain, a lot of smart, well-educated people leave the country. So there's a huge gap or shortage of technical people who have administrative or technical ability. And this is one of the biggest concerns.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Ms. Bruton, you support the Eritrean government?
What I think is that saying that I support the Eritrean government is, to me, it's a vague statement.
Okay.
I don't think that there is a viable alternative to the Eritrean government. And I think that if we want to help the people of Eritrea, there's 2 ways to do it. One, we can push for some disorderly change of power that is likely, in my opinion, to lead to a situation that looks a lot like South Sudan or Somalia. Or we can work with the present government to try to persuade them to address some of our concerns for their own sake. You asked a question about ideology.
Yeah.
I think the Eritrean government has a very strong ideology. I think they themselves have, especially in recent times, pointed out that their ideology has not been as successful as they would have wanted it to be. For me, when I look at the situation in Eritrea, I see, unfortunately, a very painful limbo. And I think that that limbo is primarily caused by the fact that the Ethiopian army is occupying Eritrean soil. And it's not only that they're occupying the border, there are assaults on the border.
There are what? What did you say?
Assaults on the border. One of them in July was a very serious assault. There are bombings of Eritrean territory that are not reported in the press. The Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Hailemariam Desalegn, has repeatedly promised to invade Eritrea in the parliament. This has persuaded Eritrea, not unreasonably, that it is in a state of threat constantly. And that is one of the reasons that they've prolonged the national service. Others disagree, and I acknowledge the disagreement. They say, well, Eritrea could just ignore the threat and disband the military. But it's hard for me to see how they could do that, particularly because, as my colleagues have pointed out, almost all the jobs in Eritrea are performed by national service volunteers. And transforming those positions into paid private sector and civil service posts takes a certain amount of money.
So when you said they do have a strong ideology, you didn't describe what the ideology was. Do you agree that it's Marxist ideology?
It was Marxist ideology in days past. I think that they abandoned the explicit ties to Marxism quite a while ago, but I would certainly characterize it as socialist. They don't call it socialist, but that's how I would characterize it, yes.
So when you say the community service, government service is voluntary, how do people feed themselves? How do they receive no salary? They're forced to work for the government?
If you were to speak with diplomats or an Eritrean on the street, I've asked a lot of people on the street in Asmara about national service. Some of them have horrific experiences with it, there is no doubt. I don't question the testimony of any person who, for example, has spoken to the Commission of Inquiry. I am grateful for their courage in coming forward. But there are also many people that I've spoken to who have said things like, you know, national services, I go on Friday, I give my boss my paycheck, and the rest of the time I do my normal job. Or national services a few hours a day, and they drive a taxi cab for the rest of the time. I am not in a position to be able to say which of those experiences is the norm, but I would certainly point out that anecdotally, when I've talked to people, that's the kind of experience they express.
So does the government subsidize parts of life? I mean, because the way it's been described, it's forced labor, it's slavery, people are not paid. So I'm just trying to figure out which is it.
People are very poor, and the wages for the national service are not living wages. They are a pittance. They're worse than a pittance.
So does the government subsidize, or is everybody starving?
So the government, no, there's not that much hunger in Eritrea that I've ever witnessed. The government does provide a voucher of sort of that provides for basic goods. If you want to buy more than that basic basket, the cost of goods is very high. I think people depend, as in other African nations, very, very heavily on remittances and on the informal economy and jobs, second jobs, third jobs that they really scrape together.
So
the economic condition is not good.
So how do you explain then the 5,000 folks a month that leave and all of the human rights reports about Eritrea?
The latest figures that I have seen from the UN has been more like 3,000 refugees a month. I mean, I can look at that and
That's a lot of people.
it's still a lot of people. I don't know how many Eritreans really leave. There is a lot of talk, for example, that I have heard confirmed by members of the human rights community, that, for example, Somalis, Ethiopians, Sudanese sometimes adopt Eritrean personas because of the privileged status that Eritrean refugees have in Europe. Until very recently, they've had an automatic asylum preference, and that's led a lot of people to say, for example, that they're Eritrean. I have no idea what the numbers are.
Whatever the numbers are, why are a lot of people fleeing?
A lot of people are fleeing because the human rights situation is terrible. A lot of people are fleeing because the economic situation is terrible. I would point out to you that if you look at Somaliland, which is very close to Eritrea and is known as a kind of a democratic oasis in the Horn of Africa, the vast majority of youth leave Somaliland too because they don't have economic options. It's unfortunately, migration is a reality for a lot of people in Africa, and Eritrea is no exception. And I do agree it is worse because of the human rights situation and the ongoing war with Ethiopia.
And just one last question. So what is the human rights situation from your vantage point, from your viewpoint? What are the human rights abuses?
I think that all of the human rights abuses that have been described are absolutely real. I think that the question is, and the reason that I asked the question earlier from the intelligence officer who asked, is there a government in Eritrea, are these abuses systemic? Are they the result of deliberate government policy, or how much are they the result of poverty, the no peace, no war, bad behavior by people outside of Asmara that the government has a poor grip on? What is the relationship between the political side of the government and the military? We have virtually no knowledge of that. I have no doubt that the military are bad actors. The extent to which their behavior is contoned by the government, I don't really know. I've talked to people, senior people in the government and as Mara, and I may be super naive, but sometimes I think they really believe that human rights abuses don't exist, or if they do, that they're very, very few and far between.
So you're able to go?
Yes, and to travel very freely.
Did you two want to say something before I
Yes,
close?
I would most definitely like to say something. The people of Eritrea who have been victims of the cruelest power I have ever read about or even seen, it seems to me like there is an effort to make it look so much better than it really is. For me, what do we expect government officials to say? These are the very same people who have been designated as having committed crimes against humanity by the United Nations Commission on International.
Are you referring to the people that she was talking about? Is that what you're reacting
Yes,
to?
let me tell you, I am a priest. I am in contact with the people who have left the country so many times. I've been to Israel a couple of times and have interviewed so many people and know how the people feel and how they have suffered under this regime. And therefore, this effort to make it look like Eritrea is doing its best, and because the president said this and that, government officials said this and that, it does not represent what the people experience and what the people go through at all. There is an utter poverty precisely because of the policies of the government. And something was said about vouchers. The voucher system was designed to control the people. You get vouchers if you are loyal, and if your loyalty is questioned, your vouchers are held up, which means that the things that you rely on your daily basis, you are denied.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
Can I just make a comment? I'm just really baffled by Mrs. Bruton's statement. I don't know what country she's talking about. Because every statement she made, that's the talking point of the regime. You can read it everywhere. You can read it in the website. And she has categorically denied that she has associations in Nefsan while she appears on the ruling party's rallies and events in the U.S., jointly with the vice president of Nefsan. I mean, there are pictures of her trying to whip up support for the president attending this event. For me, it is really mind-boggling that she denies have any relationship with Nefsan. As to the comments of the issue of the economic conditions, the social conditions, she's absolutely right. The issue is very complicated, and we shouldn't get it right. Problem is, she has gotten it right so many times. In the short 18 months, she has been interested in Eritrea. She got it right. She got it wrong when she said there is no involvement in Eritrea and Somalia. There's no involvement of support for the Shabab. She got it wrong when she said about the Commission of Inquiry. She has gotten it wrong so many times. In the short period, she became suddenly interested after Nefsan started funding the Atlantic Council. She's right. She's very complicated, and we should get it right.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. I'll just conclude with a few final questions. Dr. Bashir, you, in your testimony, said that since it ended the gold production phase and moved to copper production, which requires more logistical support and infrastructure to export, Nefsan has relied on the Eritrean Ministry of Defense, provided with slave labor for mining and security and transportation services. You point out that every year the Eritrean government rounds up about 20,000 11th grade students, 16 to 18 years of age, to finish senior high in Sawa military camp, after which most, excepting a tiny minority, are conscripted. The overwhelming majority of the youth are sent to work for the ruling party's companies, which supply slave labor to Nefsan and other companies. And then you go on, and again, your testimony will be made a part of the record. You point out and remind us of the Human Rights Watch report of January 3rd of 2013, in which that report from Human Rights Watch said NEFSM's experiences show that by developing projects in Eritrea, mining firms are walking into a potential minefield of human rights problems. Most notably, they risk getting entangled in the Eritrean government's uniquely abusive program of indefinite forced labor. And elsewhere, you point out the environmental degradation issue, which is another one as well. Could you elaborate on that? And Ms. Bruton, if you could speak to that as well. I mean, hundreds, thousands, whatever the number of young people or any people who are forced to be part of this. I mean, I remember in Burma when an American oil company was very much a part of the junta there in Burma was forcing them to be part of building a pipeline. And many of us raised strong objections to that Texas-based oil company doing that. No matter where it is, it's wrong. So the accuracy of that, the Human Rights Report, Human Rights Watch report, and you also point out WikiLeaks also has some insights on that as well. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the 20,000 number is the high school graduate. This is what I mean. Every year, there are about 20,000. That's what I mean by that. As to, there's a couple of lawsuits in Canada filed by former conscripts who are in Canada, and some of them the U.S. and in Ethiopia. I just spoke last night with the attorney who's representing them to get an update of what the case is. And he told me that NEPSON has filed a motion to dismiss the case, and they suggested that the case be tried in Eritrea. The same tactic NEPSON have used when asked to disclose financial transaction to the UN monitoring group. They referred the request to the Eritrean government, and when the Eritrean government is asked about financial transactions or records about NEPSON, they would say, well, you'll have to ask NEPSON. So there is a case to be decided in the next couple of months. If the judicial system in Eritrea is capable of handling this case, that is a pending lawsuit filed by 3 former conscripts who allege human rights abuse and all the allegations that were listed in the human rights report.
Ms. Bruton?
I don't want to pretend to know more than I know about mining. But I do want to say that I think you raised a very important concern when you said that Western firms operating in Eritrea run the risk of becoming entangled, even if they're careful, at least in reputational damage because of the National Service Program. And that has had severe consequences. The consequences are that China is taking over, basically. All of the mining projects that are coming in line, 5 or 6 big ones in Eritrea, are Chinese firms. And you may have good opinions of NEPSON or bad opinions of NEPSON, but Canadian firms have more to fear from public relations scandals than Chinese ones do. And they tend to be more concerned about safety and human rights and other things. And I personally think that ceding that ground to China is not in the interests of the Eritrean people. I think it would be great to get Western investment into Eritrea because I think that there is a positive influence to be exerted there. And it's one that the Eritrean government will be responsive to because it's investment. And that's often the best way to get change.
But again, all the more reason why EITI ought to be a very serious goal. And I don't disagree even this much with the China concern. I chair the China Commission. Chinese human rights abuses, Xi Jinping is in a race to the bottom with North Korea when it comes to those abuses, and that's manifested all over Africa where they can get away with it. So, but the standard for Canada or the United States or any other country in Europe or Africa ought to be so high for OSHA-type protections for occupational health and safety and a living wage to ensure, and certainly no forced labor. Dr. Bashir?
Can I just make a quick comment? Even NEPSON becomes transparent and we have all this disclosure about corporate responsibility, environmental reports. These are unaudited reports. There is no civil society. There is no independent verification of what NEPSON or any Western company would claim in the absence of civil societies, independent verification. So that it just becomes a useless exercise because all this report that we hear, they have been unaudited. There is no third party verifying them. So the notion is the Chinese are coming and we should stay there. As you have pointed out, the Canadian companies are very notorious for human rights violation. In the last 20 years, basically what they call themselves Canadian companies, they are US companies operating out of Canada because they escape the strict regulation of the Security Exchange Commission. So they get listed in the New York Exchange and the Toronto Exchange so that they can access the capital market of the US. But in a sense, they are mostly US investors escaping the SEC regulations of filing of disclosures and so forth. So basically, if you look at the percentage of shares owned by Nipson, they're mostly US, about 80% of them. So they operate, the reason is the Canadians, they don't have a strong central security exchange like we have here. Each province in Canada has its own supervisory similar to SEC. And oftentimes, their rules are not strict. There's no stringent disclosure requirements, either human rights violations or environmental reports. Nothing is filed. It's the least required disclosure that the Canadian companies. And you probably know from the history of Talisman in Sudan and other parts of Africa, of the notorious Canadian human rights violation in the minefield. So to me, it is essentially American companies, unless they are scrutinized and fully listed in the New York Exchange, rather than being cross-listed, then we will see more disclosures from Nipson.
Two final questions, and I'll be brief because you've been very gracious with your time. How engaged has the United States been in implementing the Boundary Commission ruling of April of 2002? Father, that was one of the points. I think you all are concerned about that. When you say the U.S. should re-engage, are you suggesting, Father, that we have not been engaged? It's been on the side somewhere and crowded out by other urgent matters, or are we being robust in trying to get both parties together? And secondly, what can the United States do in the international community to help Eritrea matriculate from its abysmal human rights record? Are there new policies we need to be doing? The Boundary Commission obviously is one, getting that implemented.
The United States.
But we have a new president coming in January. This president still has, a few months to do something. Are there any bold strokes that need to be done by him, by President Obama, and the next president? What would you say if he or she were sitting there?
The United States played a critical role when Ethiopia and Eritrea went to war in 1998 to 2000. And in fact, it was the guarantor for the settlement of the border dispute and for the ruling. Once the Border Commission ruled, the United States simply disengaged. And many things can be said about that, and we can assign many reasons really for that. And the Eritrean government, perhaps legitimately, states to this day that the United States should have remained and should have fulfilled its position as a guarantor. Since then, the United States has not done much. And as has been said by so many people before, one of the reasons that the Eritrean government has forwarded for maintaining this continuously militarizing the country was because of the threat that was posed by Ethiopia. Partially that is correct. But I think, as Dr. Bashir had pointed out, removing that as one of the things that the Eritrean regime uses for its highly militarized policy will probably enable both countries to pursue peaceful relations in the future is what I believe. And yes, on paper, It has been settled, but on the ground it has not. And one of the things that Dr. Bashir said was, on 95% of the boundary, there is really no dispute. On the remaining 5%, if the United States were to be engaged and making sure that, that this is settled, I think it will go a long, long way to create the proper climate for de-escalating the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And I've also stated that both countries host armed opposition groups in their respective countries, which is one of the reasons for the continuous conflict between the two countries. And one of my recommendations was that both countries cease to sponsor these armed opposition groups in order to destabilize each other.
I think there is opportunity now. After the President Obama visit to Ethiopia, a lot of things has changed. Following the events in Yemen, the drone program has moved to Ethiopia. And as you may know, as of last January, the Arba Minj base has been closed because of the Ethiopia's human rights violations. So there is an opportunity perhaps for the US, as not a guarantor, but a signatory of the Algiers agreement, there could be an opportunity, a window in the short period of this administration has, that they can exert pressure to the Ethiopian government, at least demarcate the undisputed area of the border, which is 95%. There are only 3 areas that are disputed. So why, I mean, the Ethiopian ruling party has been very supportive, very sympathetic to the cause of the Eritreans since the independence, but yet it has been mind-boggling as why that didn't happen. I'm told these hardliners who wants to keep the option. If you have undemarcated border, presumably the port of Assab could be the Crimea of Ethiopia. They don't have to have a demarcated border to go to Assab and grab it and declare some kind of referendum. But most of the hardliners, the Ethiopian opposition, which are also based in Asmara, is this anti-Eritrean view that they have. They still don't recognize Eritrea as an independent state. They still are against the government against the Ethiopian government, precisely because of its approach or views towards Eritrea. So the border issue is very important to the Eritrean people, especially for those people who fought very hard for the Eritrean independence, the anxiety, the fear of that Ethiopian ambition that always lags the back of their mind, that Ethiopia can anytime grab Assab or re-invade Eritrea. So it's a real fear. It's not an imagined or psychological fear. So the Ethiopians do use it. The hardliners use this fear to maintain this no war, no peace. So I really urge the US government to push towards implementing the demarcation of the border. Saying that, a lot of people say Isaias uses the border issue to stay in power. I do not believe it, because Isaias will always have a reason to stay in power, border demarcation or no border demarcation. Since 1990, when we called for reform and implementation of the Constitution, we were told we have to wait for the Declaration of Independence after liberation. Then we were told we have to wait to draft the Constitution. Then the border war broke. So I do not believe that that's what keeping the SAS from implementing the rule of law or bringing reform, because simply it's an excuse. It's not, if that's not a border issue, there will be other excuse for him to stay in power.
I am glad to say that we are all on the same page with this in terms of the desperate need to do something about the Ethiopia-Eritrea border. I think the problem is that, as you well know, the United States is dependent upon Ethiopia for its peacekeeping, as we call it, contributions in Somalia, and its peacekeeping contributions in South Sudan, and its support of our drone facilities, and that makes it very difficult for us to put any kind of influence on Ethiopia. I think it's unrealistic to expect us to change that, but my concern is that rhetorically, we have not defended the border. When Ethiopia, and it admitted that it attacked Eritrea in July, the statement from the State Department was both sides need to behave themselves. And when Eritrea was bombed by Ethiopian forces last March, there was dead silence. Time and time again, in fact, we've been silent when our allies have transgressed against other countries. And what I feel afraid of is that Eritrea very justifiably believes that if Ethiopia attacks it, they are alone. And it's that perception that's leading them to be so paranoid about their defenses. And that is something we can act on, and I hope that we will.
Just last comment. I mean, half of African countries have undemarcated borders, have border issue with each other, but they don't go to wars. They don't suspend the constitution. They don't, at least they go about their lives, and while negotiating this border issue. So the border issue should not be an obstacle or a condition for the rule of law or the implementation of the constitution. To me, it's just an excuse for the president to stay in power and nothing else, nothing more.
Is there anything any of you would like to add before we conclude?
I'd like to thank you for looking at this topic, and I really hope you'll consider a congressional delegation, and I hope you'll continue to give it your attention. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you all. We will continue our focus, and a trip is certainly something we will very seriously consider. We do travel frequently, Greg and I and other members of the subcommittee, to Africa. Like I said, we were just in Juba. But I would also point out that, when it comes to human rights, I don't care what country it is. And again, as I said earlier, the Ethiopia Human Rights Act finally got passed when we lost the Republicans, the majority, and Don Payne, my friend and colleague, went from ranking to chairman again. We went back and forth a few times. He took up the Ethiopia Human Rights Act. I was his chief co-sponsor, and we did get it passed in the House, but it did not get beyond that. Our resolution, I hope, has many, many findings, and of course, I'm talking about the Ethiopian resolution. When human rights are being committed, whether it be in Northern Ireland or anywhere else, or in the United States, we need to speak out, and speak out with a clear, transparent, and bold voice. So, and that goes for, Isaias, it goes for every other country in the world. So I thank you for your very, very important input. It is a roadmap for the future. We will try to do our level best to continue pressing. I hope the administration does. I hope the new administration, whoever it is, takes Eritrea and a better life for its citizens, and a government that respects human rights and makes that a very serious foreign policy, and that we re-engage, as you pointed out, Father, on the boundary, as you all did in your comments. So I want to thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
The hearing's adjourned.
West Coast.
I do for families.